We'll now move into the question and answer session. So the first question that we're going to ask is, a common obstacle to scientists effectively working with communities is the sense, real or perceived, by both the scientists and the community, that the scientists are experts coming in from outside to tell the community what to do. How do you build trust between scientists and community leaders and incorporate non-scientific forms of knowledge into your projects? So this would go more specifically, probably at least at first, to the Thriving Earth Exchange people.
All right, I'll go ahead. This is Natasha. In the case of the Thriving Earth Exchange, we build trust and collaboration by finding organizations that are community facing, such as the International City and County Managers Association that I mentioned. Those partnerships have enabled us to gain the traction, the trust on the ground in many different types of communities. Moreover, we tend to work more closely with local scientists. Many of the communities will ask for local scientists, and oftentimes we are able to find those local scientists through the AGU network and beyond. And if not, we're building the connections that we need with those partners.
I would just kind of echo what Sarah said about the importance of listening as a means of gaining trust. It's hard to be perceived as an outsider when you're sitting down in a place and really paying attention to what people are saying, and trying to incorporate their knowledge and their wisdom and build on that. And I think so a lot of the building trust comes down to the personal kinds of things we all learned about how you build relationships and keep relationships going.
Thank you, Raj. So the next question we're asking is, are the projects completed within the Thriving Earth Exchange originally identified by the communities that are then perhaps modified through the process? Is there an opportunity for either the scientists themselves or other organizations, such as foundations, academics, etc., to propose new projects from outside or peripheral to community agencies or groups, but from a position of understanding the issues faced by their community?
So the simple answer is yes, there's always an opportunity to modify as long as it's consistent with the core value that it meets a community priority and advances sort of that community agency. So we do welcome discussions about the scope of the project. What we're careful about is anything that smacks of sort of directing the community away from their priorities or taking away their authority and their agency and their right to navigate the community path that they want to navigate. So more information is great, more opportunities are great, but steering things away from the community priority isn't.
Okay, thank you, Raj. We'll move on to our next question. So the next question refers specifically to Sarah Fortner's talk, talking about the bar chart that shows the broad subject areas that were taught. There seemed to be a clear distinction between issues that might be more considered as global issues, such as climate change, and relatively low teaching of issues that might be considered as more specifically local and day-to-day, such as mineral resources and waste disposal. And so the question is it more effective to start global and go local, or start on local issues and then scale up to global issues? I'll direct this one to Sarah to start with.
Okay, well, it's interesting. It's cool that you see connections between like mineral resources and waste disposal and local issues. A lot of the mayor's speeches in the State of the Cities report put out by the National League of Cities talks about sort of infrastructure issues and community development issues, and a lot of these intersect with flood planning, hazard planning. And then there's communities are also talking about how to save energy and advance their economy in that way. And so in some sense, maybe the top issues that mayors are identifying and that resilience planners are identifying are more in the climate hazards, water realms. And that seems to be more prevalent in the literature that they're putting out, that sort of like community perspectives are putting out, not in the the scholarly literature. Yeah, okay, and then the other interesting thing that the survey revealed was that if you're teaching issues at local scales, you're probably also teaching at most of the other scales. So you're probably also teaching state, national, and global issues. And so I would say probably people who are teaching at local scales are intentionally saying, here's how this grand challenge of climate change manifest in my community. And some of the power of this is that sometimes community literacy on these issues is pretty low. I asked my students at the start of the semester how many of them could name a local climate impact. And so we're in Ohio, and it was about 25% of my students could name a local climate impact. And so by making it local, you can see how maybe personally relevant it is to people in your community. And if your students don't know, it's good to kind of see where your community is at seeing these issues in that way. I think it's good because it allows for you to have kind of a conversation that spans scales. We know that the issue of climate and water, any of those critical issues are important at all of these scales. I think by thinking at the local scale first, we tend to then also think at the other scales and make those connections.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Okay, so the next question that we're going to go to is how have investigators or any of you found groups that are ready to move beyond having scientists come to explain what is going on and then reacting to the expert take, with the idea that some people sort of see scientists as providing explanations and not perhaps necessarily as collaborators, and then moving on to seeking the kind of civic engagement that becomes a two-way street between communities and the scientific community, or scientists within that community. And I would probably start this with Raj or Natasha.
You know, what's interesting to me is that we don't have to push very hard to find groups interested in having conversations. In fact, what we hear from groups is they're tired of being lectured at and that they really want the two-way conversation. So in fact, we're finding most groups really welcome the two-way engagement, and it hasn't been something we've had to look hard to do.
Yeah, and I think building that two-way engagement is an important way our students see how outcomes are supported in communities. I think when I think about how I've met some partners at farmers markets or in local committees, things like that. Just sitting there and learning from people and seeing what issues are people talking about. It doesn't have to be that I have to jump in and say, oh, how do I fit? How will my students fit? Sometimes it's just out of sort of personal interest in what's going on and how to actually make real connections that synergies are found.
Yeah, and I think in this day and age too, where a lot of funding and resources are being cut to communities, they're coming to us, especially the Thriving Earth Exchange, because of the fact that we are able to provide pro bono scientists that are willing and able to work with them on those community issues that they care about. So yes, we're getting more and more requests from both domestic communities and increasingly international communities as well because of this.
This is kind of related, but the civic survey that we did, we also found that most faculty that responded to the survey were doing activities that were more about sharing or going into school systems or public museums where science has a natural place than having roles in local advisory positions, things like that, or even talking to policymakers. And I think there may be just some discomfort leaving the sort of natural mode that we're in academia, and that thinking about how to work in different structures is a good activity just to undertake to see, where the momentum is.
One other thing that can maybe be helpful is, I think one of the things scientists are really good at is asking questions. And if you can deploy that in service of creating the two-way street, I think that's useful. And communities, I mean, they're experts on where they live. And so that's another opportunity to sort of build that two-way street too.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. We'll go on to another question here, which is the Thriving Earth Exchange relies on pro bono work by scientists, and in that sense, it is encouraging to see so many projects in operation. But are there any structures or financial resources available to communities who cannot find scientists willing to work for free, or perhaps to take on local work as research projects at universities with no fee? I would probably direct this originally towards the Thriving Earth Exchange people.
Yeah, I think the answer is there aren't enough, but the numbers are growing. So foundations are starting to invest in this work. Foundations like Kresge, Kavli, Rockefeller to some extent. It's also starting to happen within the science community. I know, for example, the National Institutes of Health had a community-based participatory research program, which actually required scientists and community leaders to co-apply. And I think even local foundations are starting to invest in this work. One of our hopes is that by elevating this work and elevating this way of working, we also engage more funders in thinking about what they can do to support this work, because they start to see the value of this approach. And that's a long-term vision, but I think we're making progress towards that.
This is Cassaundra at AGI. I agree with Raj. We would really love to see more resources for communities to go out and support these projects. But I know on the science funding side, at least the National Science Foundation funds broader impacts projects for scientists applying for grants. And so one thing that I would love to see more of, and that we're trying to support more in critical issues, is just getting geoscientists to think about how they can impact their communities, and either at the local level or more at the state level. And I think there's some definitely institutional resources in research to do a little bit more of this work. But so I could see scientists really partnering with the Thriving Earth Exchange to try to fund some projects there.
Well, hearing no other answers on that question, I will speak. So the question that we're going to ask is about transboundary projects. So one of our participants asked if there were any community projects foreseen at transboundary sites between the US and Mexico. And I know that the Thriving Earth Exchange works internationally, but perhaps Raj or Natasha, do you have any experience working in a transboundary fashion, either international boundaries or perhaps also state and local jurisdictional boundaries, and anything that you could say about viability of that, opportunities, obstacles related to transboundary work?
Thanks for that question, Ben. This is Natasha. We don't yet have any transboundary sites between US and Mexico in particular yet, but we have looked at opportunities in Mexico on the border, and so through our partners, essentially, we respond to whether there ought to be a project in a particular community or not. So we don't necessarily go after a particular issue unless it comes to us naturally through a partner or directly through the community. So no, not yet. We don't have any transboundary sites.
This is Cassaundra again. I'll say one project I've come across it's not community level, but it is transboundary between the United States and Mexico, is the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program, which conducted a binational study of the San Pedro Aquifer in Arizona and Sonora. So that's one example of a transboundary project, although I don't believe it had community engagement. It was more national level.
This isn't a Thriving Earth Exchange project, but there's a pretty cool project that some scientists at the National Center for Atmospheric Research are involved in that's transboundary, that looks at dengue and its transmission by mosquito vectors and how that's happening on both sides of the Mexican-US border. And that project also is kind of cool because it involves high school students who are actually helping to collect some of the mosquito larvae sample and track the incidence or occurrence of those larvae. So.
Great, thank you very much for all of those. And I'll actually add just a quick one myself. I know that the United States Geological Survey has done quite a number of studies in the borderlands between the United States and Mexico, and have published much of their work on how to use the geosciences to address some of the challenges faced in those border areas.
Can I, Ben, one thing, I think it's a great question because I think it points towards the potential for science to be part of a kind of transborder diplomacy, and that seems particularly important right now. And so whoever asked the question, I think it was a gentle nudge towards that, so thank you for that.
Well, thank you for that perspective, Raj. All right, well, that's about all we have time for today. Thank you, everyone, for your excellent questions, and thank you to Raj, Natasha, Sarah, and Cassaundra for your great talks and discussion.